Instructions on how to do that up here. I'm very proud of myself. I will be able to see your tweets. I don't tweet, if I know what I'm doing. So at this point, let's open it up for questions. Please use the microphones or speak exceptionally loudly.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Thank you so much. That was fantastic. So I have a question about your contention that if you mix the mixing of the fluids.
Yes.
Because it seems a little crazy. You know? It seems a little crazy in two counts. One is that if I mix. Can we turn this off? If I mix black and white, I end up with gray. I end up with something in the middle.
Yeah.
That's one problem from the data that he collected or concocted. And the second issue is, if I have gray, how do I then separate them into black and white again? I mean, it seems that the assumption should be that somewhat these two things are maybe fluid, but still discrete, as opposed to all a mix. So I wonder those two things. Don't I end up with gray, and then how on earth would Mendel think that if he comes back to black and white?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the question. Let me take a second stab at it. And you're right to be distressed by my reading. So I'm glad to talk more about this. If we keep your analogy with paint, with black and white, here's how I would read Mendel. Mendel seems to be saying there are two kinds of hybrid. There's the one kind in which when you bring black and white together, they stay. There is a permanent union. And this is also takes us back to what I'd said about how we shouldn't suppose that Mendel is in any way, shape, or form denying that sometimes in a hybrid you'll get a character which is in some way intermediate between the two parental characters. So if it helps us to suppose, in this case, of permanency, that black and white come together and the character is gray, that's fine. Likewise, I think Mendel would have, but anyway, if we then go to the other side, the variable case, black and white come together, but the union is impermanent. It is temporary. And we know it's temporary because when we self-fertilize the hybrids, we don't get the hybrid character. We get the parental characters returning. And the only way to make sense of that, Mendel says, is to suppose that the stuffs that come together unmix, separate into the gametes, and then, as he shows so beautifully, the way that the gametes mix accounts for the 3-to-1 ratio. So that he doesn't offer this as a completely satisfying theory. What he says is that it seems to account for what he's observed. And as I say, you can see the hawkweed experiments as then going on to explore the other side of this divide, the permanent union phenomena, the constant hybrids, as distinct from the temporary union phenomena, the variable hybrids.
Can I just add something? Excuse me, I'm infuriated. I left my computer where we're staying for the first time. And I've actually got slides on there which explain, I need a blackboard. But Greg brought up the question of notation. And this has always fascinated me as a novelist, because it's not just science, it's what you can actually put down on bits of paper. And unless you get your notation right and doing the right thing, you're going to build up problems. And the problem was actually expressed by Greg. That the letters are used for what we now perceive to be two different things. They're used for phenotype, and they're used for genotype. And they are, and this is where I would take issue with Greg, they are used for what we would now call modern genotype. But it's only on one line, or actually two lines in the paper. What he does is he says you put big A, little a, that's hybrid, that's phenotype. With big A, little a, that's another hybrid. That's describing the phenotype. And they contribute to the offspring a big A or a little a. And he writes it out like that. Now suddenly he's writing out genotype. And the other one, big A, little a. And then you put them all together and he does the arrows just like an elementary textbook on genetics. There in the paper, he does the arrows, which are the probabilities of big A going with big A going with little a, to get the three. And it goes, big A goes with big A goes with little a, big A goes with little a, you've got those two. Little a goes with little a, are you with me? I've been a teacher for a long time. And then he says big A, which is big A. He suddenly shrunk the temporary genotype, big A, back down to his original notation for a pure form is big A. So for that moment, those two lines, he is doing what we do. And this, I think, is characteristic of the whole of the work. And that is what I blame Nägeli for. Because what he needed was somebody thinking along his lines to say, wait a minute, Gregor, this is not constancy of hybridization we're talking about. This is something else. He kept getting glimpses of something else and then losing it. And I think that's the problem with the isolation. Now, whether Darwin would have provided the right sort of sounding board for him, I don't know. Whether anybody would at that period, I don't know. Because when it was all rediscovered in 1900, it was all painfully obvious what he'd done to Correns.
He didn't do it mathematically. He couldn't calculate it. I mean, you know, our best biomathematicians are mathematicians. So do you think that he was trying to mathematically look at it, and that's why he did that?
Well, no, I think he was trying to look at it mathematically, and he succeeded. I mean, he'd got all the probabilities of a big A going with a big, and he did it down through the generations. And, you know, it is startling the degree to which he's carried the thing forward, and he showed Darwin how you could get, he did 128 different combinations, I think, at the end. You put all of his combinations together, his 7 character pairs, breed them all to a hybrid, and then have the hybrids self-fertilizing, which they do naturally, and you get 128, I think that's the figure, 128 different combinations of characteristics. He did that, he wrote that out.
I'm going to let Dr. Jackman intercede before we take the next question.
I think that what Mendel's paper reflects is he lacked the imagination that Punnett has. Reginald Punnett, we show Punnett squares, and that's how we explain it to the students. There's nothing innovative in terms of our understanding of genetics, but the fact that Punnett was able to come up with these squares, and that's how we explain it. And Mendel was unable, didn't do that, not unable, he didn't do that. is the main reason, I think, that we need to advance further. That Punnett had this way of thinking about it. It was really simple in terms of squares that explains probability. We can make the square bigger. We can explain his diagram experiments, right? Mendel didn't have any of that. He had very few figures, and so people weren't able to imagine what he was talking about, even just in the context of the variable hybrid. So to me, it's it was the imagination of Reginald Punnett that allowed things to go further. Sort of immediate thing. The other interesting thing I thought was that you look at the ratios that Mendel predicted, where the number of pink fluff, the number of heterozygotes, the number of big little eggs got smaller and smaller.
Yeah.
That was for peas that self-fertilize. So that's inbreeding. It's a specific prediction of what happens when you have inbreeding, right? When you have inbreeding, you reduce the number of hybrids gradually. But the thing that became important was what Punnett's colleagues, Hardy and Weinberg, came up with when you had random breeding. That's what we teach now, is what they said, not in inbred lines, but in lines that can cross each other, and the 1 to 2 to 1 ratio stays forever. Right? That's the prime line.
Okay, if I could try to combine your comments with some of what Simon said. I think that one of the really moving aspects of Mendel's story is the way that a beautiful paper in a tradition which dies not long after he makes his contribution to it gets rediscovered after the guy's dead, 35 years after the paper is published, and becomes stimulating for a generation of people who, I want to reiterate the point, had different questions, wanted to understand the science of inheritance. And it's extraordinary and moving and kind of striking how valuable Mendel's paper was for them. It's nevertheless the case, I think, that there are no grounds for reading Mendel as trying across time to reach those people. He was looking behind him at the people that he had learned from and the people that he had read. So there's one reason there's no Punnett square, if we put it like that, in the paper, is that Mendel isn't trying to show how to think about inherited characters in general. He thinks he's illuminated one class of hybrid plants. He is read, however, from 1900 as someone who had laid the foundation for a universally valid science of inheritance.
Dr. Comfort, are you going to follow up on this, or are you going to change the topic?
Both.
Both. Carry on. This is one of our speakers from this afternoon's sessions, by the way.
Just to chime in on this question, I think
Your mic's not
I'll just yell. I think one thing that Simon was touching on, we could make more explicit, is that Mendel just didn't have the distinction between genotype and phenotype that we're used to thinking about. That wasn't, I think, a distinction he was working with, which is why he goes back. It just wasn't clearly separated in his mind, right? So that's my chiming in on that issue. To slightly change the topic, though, I'd like to ask a question of the entire panel to try to integrate your talks. Is that better? Yes? Any better? No, I'll just keep yelling. I teach a lot too. So Greg gave us a really nice presentation of Mendel's work in a world of science, of experimental science, looking for abstract generalizations from this wonderfully rich Viennese Austro-Hungarian tradition. And then the other two speakers, Simon and Andre, gave us this nice contextualization of Mendel's question. And so, particularly Simon talked about this agrarian revolution that needed to accompany the industrial revolution that was going on at the same time. I think that's exactly right. What I wanted to ask you all was for your contributions on how we can integrate those. What was the contribution of Mendel's scientific investigation to this agrarian revolution. What did the question of looking at hybridization do for the farms that the Brno monastery was running? Did that help with their crops? Did that, contribute knowledge that would produce more food or better flowers that they could sell, whatever? Can we integrate the political economic history of that time with the science that he was doing?
So if I can paraphrase, for the people of the time, what good does this do for me? That's what you want to know. Who wants to take a crack at that?
One thing we didn't get for sure is F1 hybrid seed from it. I suspect a great deal of nothing. I don't know that it had any practical at its time, did it?
Well, Andrea, did you want?
Great question. Thank you. I think Mendel worked on his research on peas because he wanted to know the rules for hybridization for the plants, especially for blossoms, because he was the member of society or in the committee in Brno for the plants, and he was in the committee which every year decided for the best blossoms of Brno, and I think Mendel solved it in this view, and I think they didn't use his rules for hybridization on farmers of the Abbey. But Mendel supported with his research people in agriculture much more than the scientists. And I think the farmers or his friends used his rules for better breeding in horticulture.
I've learned to bring text to these kinds of occasions. So here's the first sentence of Mendel's paper. He says, experience of artificial fertilization, such as is effected with ornamental plants in order to obtain new variations in color, has led to the experiments which will here be discussed.
Yeah, that's it.
So the first line, he relates himself to what we know to be, thanks to the work of Aurel and Simon and Ondra and others, to have been a growth industry within the monastery. These men were so active in all of these civic improvement organizations, the Pomological Society we heard about, the Agricultural Society, the Natural Sciences Society. So there's a way in which at the very beginning of the paper, Mendel himself indicates an overlap with all of that. But then there's the larger question, which I tried to raise in my talk. So should we see this as directed in the first instance at that improving culture? And for my part, I see it as someone who is part of that world, but whose questions fundamentally come from what he learned in Franz Unger's classroom. And the ambitions of the paper, from that moment onward, have nothing to do with practical improvement. That said, I did read that in Aurel's book that a pea breeder sent a salesperson to Brunn in the 1870s, I think, to ask Mendel, so what's become of those peas? And apparently, wasn't there a particularly delicious variety of pea that emerged from his experimental work, or so it's said. So at least at the monastery, they enjoyed the benefits.
I think is it the wrinkled peas are sweeter than the round ones, and that's why they're wrinkled. It's to do with different storage compound. That was the quote, in fact, I put up. Where it is an interesting little trick or something, but it would take too long to relate. That was that seedsman.
But it's not so sweet if you have to eat kilos and kilos for 6 years. And I would like to say one thing, we can't forget on the roots of Mendel. He came from the farm, and he was son of the farmer. And I think he saw it much more in you as a farmer than as a scientist, his work.
But the final gasp on this, the monastery was a place where the life of the mind thrived. William Bateson, at least, the chief Mendelian, Nathaniel and I share an interest in looking back on Mendel. When Bateson himself had to address agriculturalists in Britain about the relationship between pure and applied science, he said, thank goodness that Mendel wasn't charged with the task of yielding useful results straight away. He was working in an environment in which he was allowed for 8 years to pursue his experiments, to follow up new questions. And it was only because he was allowed to do that, Bateson says, that we now have the useful conclusions that we can make relevant to breeding in our time. So at least an early Mendelian looked back at Mendel and saw someone who wasn't beholden to the needs of the breeders around him, and that's why he was able to do the great work that he did.
Dr. Bamazai.
I would go back to the question of the use of the word hybridization versus inheritance in this paper. And do you think, or have you perceived whether Mendel was trying to be very careful in writing this because he was observing this hybridization rather than predicting anything like inheritance in the next, obviously he's looking at the generation, but he was being very careful in reporting what he observed as a hybridization. And also the second side, one side of the coin is that how prevalent was the word inheritance being used at that time, and did he have a choice of that usage?
There's another issue. I mean, you say inheritance, and there's the fascinating issue of what words he used for what he is talking about. And he uses Merkmal, principally, which is more or less character when he's talking about inheritance. And that, of course, to us, sounds like talking about phenotype, until we think how we actually talk. And we say somebody's inherited the blue-eye character from her mother. And suddenly we're not talking about phenotype, we're talking about the transmission of a gene. And the word character is being used for that implicitly in what we say. Now, he uses Merkmal almost all the time. But sometimes he uses the word character, a loan word from English, spelt like that. And then he uses the word Anlage once in the whole of the paper, which is factor. And it's issues like this that make you want to be able to have a conversation with the man, because all the time you're thinking he hasn't got the language, and he's not had the nerve to invent the language. That's how I felt about it, in fact. He uses the word Anlage also in a letter to Nägeli. And there, it seems to me, he's virtually saying gene. Virtually. But inheritance...
So, as ever, slightly disagreeing with Simon. I think that one way to read your very interesting remarks is that when Mendel is trying to work out his ideas, like any of us trying to work out his ideas, it's a work in progress. And so he hasn't come upon a settled vocabulary. But when it comes to understanding what it is he sees himself as contributing to, had he seen himself as contributing to the discussion on inheritance, he would have flagged that up, I think, very clearly. Darwin, as was said, publishes The Origin of Species in 1859. Darwin doesn't have a chapter on it, but he has clear passages on inheritance. And at that moment, the authorities on inheritance were seen to be the French. French medical writers had made l'hérédité into a topic. And one writer in particular, Prosper Lucas, was seen as having been authoritative. And so Darwin is aware, certainly in 1859, biologically, of inheritance as not just an identifiable subject, but one that people were being very interesting about. His work would make it much more important, not just for medicine or for agriculture, but for biology as such. So I read the instability that Simon detects in how Mendel labels the underlying material. And it is absolutely clear he has material in mind as the sign of where he's being most original. But he's explicit throughout the paper on what it is he's contributing to. And it is the question of hybrids as constant, or understanding what the law is governing variable hybrids.
I forgot element is the other word. Merkmal, character, element, Anlage. All of those four are used to different degrees.
Dr. Wieland.
My question has to do with the burning of all of his papers and that loss of that detailed record. How do you think that might contribute to our understanding? How would that, the loss of the burning of all the papers and all of his notes following his death, so that would that record, if we had it available, would that have shed some light on the questions that you're exploring here, or in any questions that might arise? How significant is the loss of that record?
Everybody hear that question? No? How significant was the loss of Mendel's notes and papers and records when they were burned after his passing? What are the implications of that, potentially, from our learned panel?
I think it had given Greg a lot of work to do.
Well, I never thought about that. The annotations that we have, so I said there are these volumes. There is the monastery's copy of The Origin of Species, the monastery's copy of The Variation of Animals and Plants Under Domestication, and the monastery's copy of Gärtner's book on hybrids. And Mendel's annotations are pretty unilluminating. In that he ends up more or less scoring the passages that he ends up writing about. And that's it. It's not as if he writes paragraphs in which he really unburdens himself about what he really thinks about Nageli or Darwin or anything like that. So what we do have makes me a little suspicious, makes me a little doubtful that Mendel would have really revealed himself in the documents that were burned. That said, as Simon just indicated, wouldn't one want to know for real? And just imagine, and it wouldn't take much. All you need to find was one letter or one manuscript, which could change everything in these interpretations. But certainly, what we do have is he's not very energetic in setting down his private thoughts.
I believe Father Ellis wants to contribute.
Hello? It works, good. I'm not trying to make a big deal out of this issue, but Simon, this is primarily directed to you. When we talk about Mendel in his autobiography saying that he went to the monastery to flee poverty, and I don't dispute that at all. I mean, I'm sure there are a lot of motivations. However, I was wondering if we can contextualize that document, because am I correct in recalling that the document was, he was presenting this to qualify to take an exam? Is that basically it? Right. So I'm trying to reconcile that with the fact of Mendel's father's will, where he distributed whatever, his estate. And he said, I believe he also said that if my son decides to go to the priesthood, then that will revert back to whatever. In other words, the part of the dowry for the sister and that type of thing. So, again, was it speculation that obviously this was before he took the exam? So, would Mendel have been talking to his father about joining the priesthood?
I'm certain he did. Yes, there is that hint that implies that it was in the air at this time. So it's a decision that he'd obviously made round about the end of his, when he was trying to get into Olomouc University, and simply couldn't afford, didn't have the money. The inheritance from the farm didn't provide anything like enough money to keep his studies going. And he must have discussed it with them. I said, yes. I mean, great drama, you know. Good for a novelist. The family.
And we know that the family had to send permission for his entrance to the abbey, and they had to agree with his decision. And sorry, one thing, I have the one facsimile of Mendel's manuscript. It's the gift for Villanova University from our museum. And if you will be curious, this is the manuscript which Mendel wrote after his lectures in 1865. It's only 12 pages. This is the basic document of genetics. If you want, you can see it.
I guess since I'm the one standing up here, on behalf of Villanova University, thank you very much, Dr. Dostow. It should also reminds me that we have part of the university's Mendel exhibit that you can come up and browse at your leisure. At this point, are there other questions from the audience? Yes.
I'd like to thank the speakers for keeping me quiet about Mendel. I learned quite a bit today. I find it fun here seeming to speculate where those other 33 were. And considering that Mendel spent a lot of time reading Darwin, could he have sent Darwin a reprint? Did maybe Darwin has it under a master?
He could have, but if so, it hasn't been found. And Darwin's off-print collection is large. And Darwin was pretty assiduous about thanking people for their reprints. So if it did happen, there's no record in the otherwise copious Darwin archive.
And we asked the archive, Darwin's archive, and Mendel didn't send the off print. Darwin had the book, The Proceeding of Natural History Society, but all articles are in German, and Darwin didn't speak German, and I think it could be one of the reasons why it didn't work on these proceedings.
I think he didn't read German well, but he could, if there were things he wanted to read.
Yeah, but he got the proceedings with 10 articles from Brno Society, and he didn't know about Mendel's research.
But maybe in this context, the point bears emphasis, as I think was mentioned, that it's not that Mendel's work disappeared. The paper was cited, respectfully.
Yes.
Someone actually has totted up the number of citations. It's on the order of 20 to 30. But it's cited, and it's esteemed by people who specialize in plant hybridization. And they esteem it as an interesting contribution. So they know about it. And there's one way to read it, to read that situation, is that they looked at it the way Mendel did. They looked at it as an interesting contribution on an aspect of an interesting problem. It didn't change everything. Mendel doesn't say, with this paper I change everything. And they didn't read him that way. It was only when the context changed that people were able to see the paper as having changed everything. And so the fact that it was cited shows that people appreciated its seriousness and its quality.
Other questions? As far as I can tell, we have no tweets. Okay, well, I want to bring this session to a close. Let me just say that, as you know, we had this symposium to celebrate the 150th anniversary of the publication of Mendel's paper, and we intentionally decided to start today. We're trying to learn more about Mendel as a person and Mendel as a scientist. So please join me in a round of applause for our distinguished students. Feel free to return this afternoon, where we turn to topics of what we've called modern genetics and the ethical, legal, and social implications related to modern genetics. I have two comments. As a publishing scientist, I sure as heck hope none of my papers ever get the level of scrutiny that Mendel's paper got, and I'm sure those of you who publish feel the same way. And the thing that keeps me awake at night is, if yellow is dominant, why are all peas green? If you signed up for lunch, lunch will be in the back. Thank you very much.